Night closed over the ridge line with deliberate calm. Below it, a narrow supply route threaded the valley like a vein, and above it an enemy outpost sat in patient silence. The position was built not to see, but to hear. On high ground, sight was unreliable, trees broke shapes, darkness softened edges, but sound traveled cleanly. Boots, metal, breath out of rhythm with the wind. The hill listened, and listening had kept it alive. Every approach was designed to betray the careless. Low wire stretched across likely paths would hum faintly if touched, a thin metallic warning that carried farther than footsteps ever did. Gravel was left exposed in places where men wanted soft earth, because gravel confessed weight and hesitation. Even the sentries, bored and stiff with cold, possessed a trained alertness, the ability to separate night noise from intention. Weeks without a serious probe had reinforced the belief that nothing reached the ridge without being announced first. In the dead ground below, the shallow pocket where slope and trees dulled sound, a small raiding team moved forward on elbows and knees. They did not rush. Speed, here, was measured in restraint. Every man understood the rule written by experience: the first loud shot wakes the hill, the second fixes attention, the third closes every way out. Raids failed not from lack of courage, but from excess noise. One figure carried a weapon that seemed to mock the seriousness of the task. It was short, compact, and fitted with an oversized tube that looked ungainly even in the dark. The attachment had none of the sharp geometry of standard issue. Its surface appeared almost soft, almost domestic, an object that belonged in a workshop, not a fight. Somewhere, someone had once called it the toilet roll silencer, the kind of joke soldiers make when improvisation threatens their sense of professionalism. No one laughed tonight. The man carrying it had stopped caring about appearances long ago. In his hands, function mattered more than form, and pride mattered less than seconds. The team halted within meters of the first sentry. The world compressed until it contained only breath control and timing. Inhale, hold. Exhale, slow, silent. The sentry shifted his stance, bored confidence written into the movement of someone who expected warning before danger. The suppressed weapon rose. The shot was controlled, close, and subdued, less an explosion than an interruption. The sentry fell without a cry. And the outpost did not react. No alarm. No flare. No rush of noise down the ridge. Instead, something more dangerous began to happen. The position started to disappear, not in fire or chaos, but in silence, one unnoticed second after another. Modern combat is loud by nature. Rifles crack, machine guns stitch the air, artillery folds distance into thunder. Yet in that constant noise, control often belongs to a quieter power, the side that decides when the noise begins. If you can choose the first moment of recognition, you can shape everything that follows. The difference between victory and disaster is sometimes measured in a few seconds of confusion. Raids, ambushes, and reconnaissance live inside that narrow margin. These are not battles designed to be won by volume. They are missions designed to be completed before the enemy understands what is happening. A firefight, in this world, is usually failure, not because the raiders cannot fight, but because the fight announces itself. The moment the first loud shot rings out, reinforcements begin moving, exits begin closing, and every defender suddenly has one shared certainty: contact. Conventional weapons speak in a language the enemy understands instantly. A muzzle flash is a direction. A rifle report is a trigger. Shouts become orders. Flares climb into the sky and turn darkness into exposure. Even if the first exchange is small, the noise carries authority. It tells every man within range what kind of night this will be, and it summons the machinery of response: searchlights, machine gun belts fed into place, mortars lifted and set. This is why special operations doctrine emerged not as romance, but as necessity. Strike precisely. Disappear quickly. Leave confusion behind. The goal is not to prove courage under fire. The goal is to deny the enemy the chance to organize fire in the first place. In that logic, the best fight is the one that never becomes a fight at all. Silence, then, is not an absence. It is a tool. Remove the sound, and you delay comprehension. Delay comprehension, and you create a window where the enemy cannot coordinate, cannot warn, cannot decide which direction danger truly comes from. A sentry who falls without shouting does not simply die, he takes the outpost's first warning with him. The enemy's nervous system remains asleep even as the body is being dismantled. Here the paradox becomes clear: secrecy is not only hiding yourself. It is making the enemy misread reality for long enough to act. Darkness helps, camouflage helps, disciplined movement helps, but nothing disrupts understanding like a weapon that refuses to announce itself in the expected way. Confusion, bought cheaply, can replace firepower bought at enormous cost. And that is why this story begins with a device mocked for its appearance. Because its value is not beauty, or pride, or tradition. Its value is delayed awakening, the priceless few seconds before an outpost realizes it is already being taken. Far from the ridgeline and its listening sentries, the problem began in quieter places, workshops where the war arrived as requirements on paper and constraints in metal. An engineer faced the kind of pressures that never appear in after-action reports, scarce materials that had already been promised to tanks and aircraft, tight timelines that left no room for elegance, and covert requirements that demanded results without publicity. The device had to work in darkness, under stress, in hands that could not afford to baby it. A suppressor, in its simplest form, has two responsibilities. It must reduce the blast, the sharp, unmistakable report that travels and summons response. And it must control the signature, the flash, the abrupt violence of escaping gas, the sensory clue that tells an enemy exactly where to look. But it had to do this without turning a weapon into a fragile toy. A frontline tool cannot be delicate. It must survive mud, cold, hurried cleaning, and the blunt habits of men who will use it at night with trembling hands. The engineer chose an architecture that was not beautiful, but practical. Baffles to slow the gas. Expansion chambers to give pressure room to die down. And inside, elements that were almost sacrificial, soft internal pieces designed to take punishment, to trap and tame the violence of the shot at the cost of wearing out over time. It was not a perfect solution. It was a solution that admitted what war does: it consumes tools as it consumes men. The result looked absurd. A chunky cylinder that made the weapon appear lopsided, as if someone had bolted a piece of improvised plumbing onto a firearm and hoped for the best. In the hands of an armor raised on clean lines and standard issue, it violated the aesthetics of proper weapons. It did not resemble authority. It resembled embarrassment. And in military culture, embarrassment invites laughter faster than it invites evaluation. Officers and armorists joked about it because joking is safer than admitting uncertainty. Calling it a toilet roll was a way to protect pride, a way to dismiss improvisation without having to test it seriously. The war produced enough genuine horrors, men clung to the comfort of familiarity, even in hardware. But the inventor persisted. Not because he enjoyed ridicule, and not because he believed beauty was irrelevant. He persisted because the battlefield rewards function more than pride, especially in the dark, where the first sound can decide whether a raid becomes a massacre. If the device bought even a few seconds of confusion, it could buy lives. And here the story's irony settles into place. Ridicule often arrives first, precisely because the idea is unfamiliar. The laughter comes early, before the night comes when laughter can no longer survive the results. Armies are built on repetition. The larger the force, the more it depends on standardization, parts that fit, procedures that can be taught quickly, weapons that behave the same way in every climate and in every hand. Commanders value reliability not as a preference, but as a form of control. In that world, suppressors look like trouble. They are attachments, extra components that complicate supply, training, inspection, and maintenance. They introduce variety into a system designed to minimize it. Early suppressed systems gave officers practical reasons to be cautious. They could be temperamental, especially when pushed beyond the clean conditions of a test range. Baffles wore down. Internal elements degraded. Carbon fouling accumulated faster. A suppressor that worked well for a handful of shots might behave differently after prolonged use, or after being cleaned badly, or after being dropped into mud. Some designs were sensitive to ammunition types, performing acceptably with one load and poorly with another. For a commander responsible for many units, maintenance heavy is not a technical note. It is a warning. Suppressors also altered the weapon's behavior in ways that were difficult to tolerate in conventional infantry doctrine. They could reduce muzzle velocity slightly, changing the energy delivered on target. They could shift the point of impact, forcing re-zeroing and careful familiarity between shooter and weapon. They added length and weight, affecting handling in tight terrain. And, most seriously, they introduced new failure points at the worst possible moment, loosened mounts, baffled strikes, degraded internals that turned quiet into loud without warning. In a raid, that sudden failure does not simply change sound. It changes fate. Beyond mechanics, there was doctrine, a deeper belief about how wars are won. Conventional armies win by massed fire and momentum. They break positions with volume, hold ground by force, and treat loudness as a kind of certainty. Suppressed weapons seem to belong to a different kind of fighting, the kind that did not scale. A suppressor might help a handful of men, but it did not look like something that could carry an army across a continent. To leaders trained in broad operations, whispering at the enemy felt like a distraction from the real business of war. Then there was the moral discomfort, quieter but persistent. Silent killing carried an intimacy that unsettled people who lived at a distance from it. Artillery and airstrikes allowed abstraction, destruction arriving from far away, impersonal and industrial. A suppressed shot suggested something else, deliberate proximity, a man choosing a moment, the victim often unaware until the end. To those who did not live in raids and clandestine work, it could feel like assassination rather than combat, too easily misunderstood, too easily politicized if it went wrong. War already demanded brutality, leaders worried about a brutality that looked, wrongly, to some eyes like secrecy for its own sake. So leadership faced a dilemma that was both practical and institutional. Approve unusual tools for unusual work, accepting complication and risk for a narrow advantage. Or keep war inside familiar boundaries, where doctrine and logistics remained clean, even if that cleanliness cost opportunities. In peacetime, bureaucracy chooses predictability. In war, it often tries to keep predictability anyway, because the alternative feels like losing control. That is why distrust hardened into restriction. Not cowardice, not ignorance, bureaucracy defending itself against chaos. But every rule written to protect an institution eventually meets the kind of night when the institution's comfort matters less than a small team's survival, and the people at the edge of the map begin asking for permission to fight differently. Raiders, scouts, and resistance liaisons lived at the edge of the map, places where lines on paper became uncertain, and where a single alarm could erase a team faster than any enemy battalion. Their war was not fought in open fields with banners of firepower. It was fought in hedgerows, forests, lanes, and ridge shadows, where distance was short and consequences arrived quickly. For them, being discovered was not an inconvenience. It was often the end of the mission and, sometimes, the end of the men. They did not need loud dominance. Loudness belonged to armies. Loudness summoned artillery, drew attention, and invited escalation. What raiders needed was quiet control, one sentry removed without waking 10 more, one wire cut without a flare rising, one doorway crossed without a shout turning the whole position into a single alert organism. Their advantage was not weight. It was timing. They needed the enemy to remain asleep long enough for action to be completed. And their targets were rarely just bodies. They went after systems, the things that held an enemy unit together and connected it to the wider front. Radios mattered more than rifles because radios could call mortars. Officers mattered not because of rank, but because leadership organized fire. Mats mattered because they revealed routes and weak points. Fuel stores mattered because vehicles were useless without them. A raid that destroyed or captured these things could shift a local front line without requiring a large battle. It was war reduced to precision. In that kind of work, a suppressor was not a luxury and not a novelty. It was a time-buying device. It did not make a gun silent in the romantic sense. It made the first shot less legible at distance, less likely to trigger immediate, coordinated response. It turned a clean report into something that could be mistaken: a mechanical noise, a distant exchange, a sound that did not demand instant interpretation. Those delayed seconds were not small. They were the margin that allowed a second sentry to be approached, a radio room to be reached, an exit route to remain open. Even the device's ridiculous appearance could become a kind of advantage. The toilet roll look signaled nothing impressive. It did not carry ceremony or intimidation. It invited fewer expectations, less likely to be recognized as a serious tool by men who judged equipment by how it looked in daylight. In war, contempt is a blindfold. When an enemy underestimates the method gained space to work. But none of it mattered without training that matched the tool. Raiders had to adapt their habits to silence the way infantry adapted to noise. Shot placement had to be careful. Distance had to be close enough to be sure. There could be no waste rounds, no panic bursts, no loud exchanges that turned a controlled entry into a conventional fight. Movement had to be disciplined, metal secured, breathing controlled, steps planned. Once inside wire, improvisation was not courage. It was exposure. The men who carried suppressed weapons learned a different kind of restraint. They learned that every second was a resource, and that the enemy's warning system, his ability to understand what was happening, was the most valuable thing to steal. Because once you stole that, you could steal everything else: his radio, his route, his confidence, his position. And that is the deeper belief that drove them, even when command hesitated. If you can take away the enemy's first warning, you can take away his outpost before he even knows it is being taken, and the hill will remain quiet long enough for the impossible to become routine. The outpost on the ridgeline had not been built for comfort. It had been built for detection. Its purpose was simple: to sit above a supply route and notice the first sign of approach. The position was organized like a listening instrument. There were small listening posts pushed forward, men placed where sound traveled best. There were tripwires and Tinker alarms arranged in likely gaps, crude but effective in a quiet night. In some sectors, dogs were used not for aggression but for early warning, their nervous attention more reliable than any sentry after midnight. And around all of it were overlapping fields of fire, machine guns, and rifles positioned so that, once contact was confirmed, the ridge could answer in volume. The guards trusted routine because routine was what they had. They learned the sounds of night until those sounds became a kind of map. Wind in branches had its pattern. Small animals had their own careless rhythm. A branch snapping under a boot sounded different from a branch snapping under a deer. Even whispered voices carried a particular cadence when men tried not to be heard. Sentries were trained to listen the way sailors listen to weather, not looking for a single obvious signal, but for something out of place. And over time, confidence grew in the most dangerous way, through repetition. Weeks without a serious probe began to feel like proof. A perimeter that had not been tested began to be described as clean, as if cleanliness were a permanent state rather than a temporary condition. The outpost's defenses became familiar enough that the garrison stopped imagining the ways they could be bypassed. The wire stayed in place. The gravel stayed exposed. The same patrol routes were walked, the same listening points manned, until predictability began to feel like security. The garrison also believed something that was not irrational, but was incomplete: any attack would begin loudly. Most attacks did. A shot, a shout, a flare war announced itself in a language that was difficult to misunderstand. Even a small probe usually produced noise because nervous men make noise, because weapons are loud, because fear often reveals itself. To men on a ridge, sound was not merely a clue. It was the beginning of every battle they had ever survived. That belief became a blindfold. Defenses optimized for noise are strongest when noise arrives. They are weakest when the first seconds remain ambiguous. Tripwires do nothing against a team that finds the gap and crosses gently. Dogs help until the wind favors the attacker, or the handler is tired, or the animal has been conditioned by too many ordinary nights. Overlapping fields of fire are impressive once someone has a reason to fire. But silence delays that reason. It keeps the ridge in its routine even as routine is being violated. This is what arrogance looks like in a professional garrison. Not swagger, not theatrical contempt. A technical assumption treating the enemy as predictable, assuming that danger will arrive in the form you have prepared to recognize. Believing that the rules of contact are fixed, first you hear the shot, then you respond. First you see the flash, then you organize. Into that assumption, the raiders brought a tool that altered the first second of contact. Not a tool that made them invisible, and not one that guaranteed success. A tool that simply delayed comprehension. And in warfare, delaying comprehension is enough to turn a well-designed outpost into a place that can be taken apart quietly before it realizes it must defend itself. Because on a ridgeline that trusted its own hearing, the most dangerous sound was not a gunshot at all. It was the absence of one, right up until the moment the ridge discovered it had already been breached. A suppressor's problem begins with physics, not romance. A gunshot is not loud because metal is rude, it is loud because hot gas wants to expand violently. Propellant ignites, pressure spikes, and a wave of energy tears out of the muzzle into open air. Sound is that violence made audible. In a normal weapon, the blast is honest, an announcement that cannot be argued with. To suppress it is to attempt something unnatural, to slow an explosion's breath without stopping the explosion itself. The engineer's answer is architecture. He gives the gas rooms to die in, expansion chambers to steal pressure, baffles to force the flow to change direction, to tumble, to cool. And inside, elements designed to sacrifice themselves, soft internals that absorb and trap, wearing down so the shooter can remain unknown for a little longer. It is a hard bargain. The device survives by consuming itself. War often demands tools that accept that bargain without complaint. But designs that behave beautifully on a bench often fail in the world that actually uses them. Mud does not respect tolerances. Coal changes materials in small ways that become large at the wrong moment. Hastily cleaned parts are reassembled imperfectly. Threads loosen. Fouling builds. Oil thickens. A suppressor has to function not only when admired by experts, but when handled by tired hands at night, when nobody has time to be gentle and nobody has light to be precise. A microbeat belongs to the inventor in his test space, leaning in close as if proximity could reveal truth. He listens to test shots the way a surgeon listens to a heart, searching for the smallest irregularity. Not only volume, but character. A harsh crack that means gas escaped too quickly. A metallic ring that suggests instability. A shift that hints at wear happening faster than planned. He does not chase silence as an absolute. He chases consistency because consistency is what keeps men alive when they trust a device. Trade-offs remain, and honest engineering admits them. Suppressors add length and weight, making a weapon harder to maneuver through brush, wire, and doorways. They can shift handling and balance, turning quick movement into careful movement. They wear out with use, and the more you demand from them, the sooner they begin to fail. In war, every advantage is purchased with some other inconvenience. This is why the real definition of silent matters. It is not Hollywood quiet. It is not a whisper in a soundstage. It is a muted report that blends into distance and confusion, something that does not immediately translate into alarm, something that buys uncertainty. The enemy may still hear something. The difference is that he cannot instantly name it, locate it, or organize around it. And that is where the struggle becomes philosophical. Precision engineering, at its most practical, exists to buy human beings a few seconds of advantage, seconds in which an outpost remains asleep, a sentry falls without warning, and a raid can succeed before the world becomes loud again. For raiders, sound was not background. Sound was exposure. Training began with the simplest humiliations, learning how loudly a man breathes when he thinks no one is listening, how a sling buckle clicks when it swings free, how a canteen taps against a button at the exact moment silence matters most. Instructors did not need speeches. They needed men to hear themselves. Metal was taped or tied down. Loose kit was stripped away. Even posture was corrected because a careless shift of weight could grind gravel or crack a twig loud enough to change the night. Approach drills were rehearsed until they felt less like movement and more like choreography. Steps were timed with wind gusts, because wind could carry away a small sound the way darkness carried away a small shape. Soft ground was chosen deliberately, hard ground was avoided like a trap. Gravel patches became something to fear, not because they were dangerous in themselves, but because they translated weight into confession. In the training field, instructors would scatter stones in pathways and wait for the first careless crunch, then stop the entire team and make them begin again. Repetition was the cost of invisibility. The suppressed weapon demanded its own kind of discipline. It did not turn a raid into something easy. It removed the excuse of chaos. Shots had to be close enough to be certain and controlled enough to be final. There could be no waste rounds fired just in case, no panic bursts used to compensate for nerves. A missed shot did not merely miss a man. It announced presence. It started the clock. It turned a silent plan into a loud emergency. A microbeat often belonged to a shooter the first time he understood what quiet really meant. He would raise the weapon and realize the suppressor was not the main challenge. The main challenge was the mind refusing to rush. Fear urges speed. Training demanded slowness. A calm trigger press. A controlled breath. A willingness to wait for the exact second when the target's head turned, when the body angle offered certainty, when the shot could be taken without needing a second. Quiet was a psychological posture as much as a mechanical one. They practiced target transitions in darkness because the first sentry is never the only sentry. In real outposts, men overlap. One guard can be seen by another. One shadow can be watched by two pairs of eyes. So raiders drilled the sequence, first sentry, then the next angle, then the next pocket of possible movement, all without speaking. Hand signals replaced voices. Touch replaced signals when even a gesture felt too visible. They learned to move as a unit without becoming noisy as a group. The cost of this kind of work was not only physical, it was moral. Silent action removes the emotional cover of chaos. In a firefight, noise can blur memory. In silence, every detail becomes sharp. A man remembers the exact distance, the exact timing, the precise sound of a body hitting ground. In quiet raids, responsibility feels concentrated, intimate. War, for a moment, stops being industrial and becomes personal. That is why the team had to become a machine of restraint. Not a machine of aggression, but of controlled decision built to take a place without triggering the place's own alarm. Because the goal was never simply to kill. The goal was to keep the outpost asleep long enough to dismantle it. And once men could move with a discipline, once they could treat sound like a weapon pointed back at themselves, the raid stopped depending on luck. It began to depend on a single fragile requirement, that the first shot, and the first second after it, remained ambiguous to the enemy. By the time the raiders were ready to move, the operation already existed in their heads like a rehearsed sequence. It was planned less like an attack and more like choreography, the entry point chosen for the way shadows lay on the wire, the sentry order mapped according. To patrol habits, the radio position marked as a priority, and the withdrawal lanes measured not for speed but for quiet. A raid is not one at the objective. It is one in the plan that prevents the objective from ever becoming a fight. In that plan, suppression was not a novelty bolted onto a familiar method. It was integrated into the timetable itself. Silence was not simply desirable, it was the schedule. Every step assumed that the enemy would remain uncertain for a limited window, and every action was timed to happen before that window closed. The suppressor did not create the plan, it made the plan possible. It offered the first few seconds of delayed comprehension that the whole sequence depended upon. Roles were assigned with the cold clarity of men who understood that improvisation is what happens when control collapses. One man became the cutter, responsible for wire and openings. Another held overwatch, watching angles where a second sentry might appear. A shooter carried the suppressed weapon, not because he was the most aggressive, but because he was the most controlled. A collector was tasked with the purpose of the raid, maps, documents, radio crystals, codes, whatever the mission demanded. Each role was a small oath: do your part, do it quietly, do it without hesitation. A microbeat unfolded in the dark before movement began. Under dim light, shielded, Minimal, a man checked the suppressor's internals with careful hands. He did not treat it as a talisman. He treated it as a point of failure. Where could turn quiet into catastrophe? A loose mount, degraded internals, carbon fouling, small problems that could become a loud one at the worst second. He checked because in raids, equipment is not a background detail. It is a time limit. The target, too, was defined correctly. An outpost was not merely a building on a ridge. It was a node in a system, the listening point that protected a supply route, a set of eyes and ears that allowed the enemy to react before the valley could be used freely. If that node was seized, the route opened, not permanently, but long enough for trucks to move, for units to reposition, for the front to breathe. The raid's purpose was not glory. It was function. This is the key revelation: covert success is rarely a single brilliant moment. It is a chain of unbroken small decisions, each one quiet, each one correct, each one made before the enemy can name what is happening. When the chain holds, the objective collapses almost gently. When the chain breaks, the night becomes loud. And by the time the first shot is finally fired, the outpost is already being dismantled in the attacker's minds, reduced from a fortress of listening into a sequence of tasks, so waiting only the first second of silence to begin. The final approach to a perimeter is always the narrowest part of a raid, not in distance but in tolerance. Wire lay ahead like a feint, dark handwriting against the slope, and beyond it the outpost shapes were only half visible: huts, sandbags, the suggestion of a trench line. In those last meters, every heartbeat feels loud. Every breath threatens to become a signal. The team moved in inches, using shadow as if it were cover made solid, knowing that one careless scrape of metal could do what enemy skill might not: wake the hill. The cutter found the chosen point with the calm of rehearsal. Hands worked slowly, as if time were generous, because haste makes noise. A narrow opening appeared in the wire, controlled and minimal, just enough for bodies to pass without dragging equipment. The team slipped through one by one, their movements reduced to deliberate weight shifts, each man stepping where the ground was soft, avoiding the patches that would crunch and confess. A sentry stood ahead, turned slightly away from them, his outline fixed against the darker background of trees. He was not asleep. He was not careless in the obvious sense. He had the casual confidence of routine, the posture of a man who believes he will hear trouble before he must see it. He scanned the dark with small, unhurried movements, trusting the wire and the silence, trusting that danger would arrive in the form it always had. The suppressed weapon rose, and in that instant the device's ugliness stopped mattering. The shot was controlled, close, and subdued, more like a puncture than an explosion. No flash leapt outward. No report rolled across the ridge. The sound that did exist was small enough to blend into the night's ordinary clutter, a dull, brief interruption that did not demand an answer from the far side of the position. The sentry fell without a shouted warning. His body folded into the ground with a softness that felt almost unnatural after years of war noise. And the outpost's nervous system remained asleep. No flare rose. No alarm was raised. No machine gun began its familiar search of darkness. The hill, built to hear everything, did not yet understand that its first warning had just been removed. A microbeat belonged to the team leader in the seconds after. He did not celebrate. He counted. 1, 2, 3, measuring the invisible space between action and comprehension. He knew that even silence could not last forever. Somewhere, a guard would turn at the wrong moment, or a man would step into the wrong patch of gravel, or a routine check would discover absence where a sentry should be. The raid depended on how long the outpost could remain unaware, and that length was never certain. This is the turning truth of suppressed warfare: silence is not the absence of violence. It is violence that arrives before comprehension. It is the removal of warning, the theft of the enemy's first coherent thought. Loud battle gives defenders a script. Silence denies them one. For a few precious seconds, the defenders are not fighting an attack. They are still living inside routine. And because the outpost had not yet been told it was under attack, the raid could accelerate. The team moved forward with controlled speed, shifting from approach to dismantling, from infiltration to seizure. Each man understood that the first shot had not simply killed a sentry. It had opened a window in time. Inside that window, an entire position could be taken apart quietly before the hill found its voice and before the night became loud enough to summon the world. Once the first sentry fell and the ridge remained quiet, the team moved through the position like a tide that did not splash. They advanced one corner at a time, one angle at a time, each man staying inside his role as if the plan were a set of rails. In the dim shapes of sandbags and huts, control meant sequence. No running. No shouted commands. Only touch on a shoulder, a hand signal, a pause long enough to let the night settle again. A second sentry appeared where routine placed him, near a bend in the trench line, half turned toward the valley, listening for the sounds he expected. The raiders did not argue with routine, they used it. The suppressed weapon rose, close and steady, and the sentry was neutralized before his breath could become warning. Still no alarm followed, because the outpost had no clear direction to blame. Danger without a sound is difficult to locate. Uncertainty delays reaction, and delay is what raids spend like currency. The radio room became the heart. In a small outpost, communications are more than convenience, they are identity. A position that cannot speak to higher command is isolated even while it still exists. Cutting the radio meant cutting the outpost's ability to turn suspicion into reinforcement. It meant that even if a man discovered something wrong, his first shout would remain local, trapped inside the ridge. The raiders understood this with a cold clarity. Silence is not only about the weapon. It is about preventing the enemy from sharing knowledge. A microbeat unfolded in a doorway where the stakes were suddenly intimate. A man inside began to wake, mouth opening on instinct, confusion rising toward sound. A raider's hand covered that mouth, not as cruelty, but as necessity. The one noise that changes everything is not always a gunshot. Sometimes it is a human voice, the first coherent alarm that turns a sleeping garrison into a fighting unit. In that brief contact, the raid's logic was exposed, restraint used as force. The commander's hut was reached with the same quiet certainty. Documents were seized, maps, orders, codes, whatever the mission had defined as the true target. The purpose of the raid was fulfilled before the garrison understood the premise. Men were removed, rooms were cleared, and the outpost center was taken without the ridge ever experiencing the moment it had been trained to expect, the loud beginning. The few shots that were fired were swallowed by night, mistaken at distance for something else, distant fighting, a mechanical clank, a noise without urgency. The outpost remained confused because confusion is what silence produces best. No one could say, with certainty, where the attack was, or how large it was, or even if it was real. And the climax resolved in restraint. The outpost was taken not by overwhelming fire, but by stolen seconds and disciplined quiet, by a method that made a strong position weak simply by denying it the sound it needed to become awake. In raids, victory is not the moment you seize the objective. Victory is the moment you leave it. The longer a team remains inside an enemy position, the more likely reality catches up. Someone notices an absence, a man wakes at the wrong time, a routine check becomes a discovery. The outpost may be quiet, but it is not dead. It is merely delayed. So withdrawal begins immediately, almost as soon as the purpose of the raid is fulfilled, because time is the one resource a raiding force never truly controls. The team moved with the same discipline that carried them in, but now every movement had a different weight. Entry is cautious because silence is fragile. Exit is urgent because silence is temporary. They placed small charges or sabotaged key equipment, enough to disable, not enough to announce. This was not demolition for spectacle. It was denial, a cut cable, a damaged radio set, a compromised weapon emplacement, small acts that reduced the outpost's ability to recover quickly. The goal was to leave behind confusion and inconvenience, not a blazing signal flare that would guide pursuit. A microbeat unfolded at the center of the raid's real purpose. In a dim room, someone retrieved paper, maps folded and refolded, codes written in careful hand, a notebook that explained schedules and names. It looked insignificant in the way paper often does, yet it could be more valuable than bodies. A captured document could save lives down the road, reroute supply convoys, reveal weak points, prevent an ambush that had not happened yet. War is frequently decided by information, and information is often small enough to fit inside a jacket. The team began to slide back through the position, leaving it altered but not yet awake. Then, somewhere behind them, a shout finally rose, delayed, confused, arriving late like thunder after lightning. It was not a coherent alarm at first. It was a question turned into sound. A man calling another man's name. A voice that carried uncertainty rather than command. But once the first shout existed, the outpost's nervous system began to stir. Light snapped on in a hut. Boots thudded. A rifle bolt cycled in the dark, loud because it was suddenly being heard. The enemy response came quickly, but it was the response of men reacting to uncertainty, not to contact. Searchlights swept the ridgeline in broad arcs, probing darkness that offered no clear target. Machine guns fired into tree lines and empty slopes, their traces stitching the night as if violence could compensate for missing information. Flares rose and fell, turning snow and branches into sharp black and white, but still revealing nothing certain. The outpost had been trained to respond to noise. Now it responded to the absence of understanding. This is the operational lesson that raids teach best. The most successful raids end with the enemy still arguing about what happened. Confusion forces defensive overreaction. Overreaction wastes ammunition, exhausts men, and makes the next night harder to interpret. The outpost might recover its composure by dawn, but by then the damage is already done, equipment disabled, documents missing, routes opened, confidence cracked. The raiders disappeared into the same quiet that carried them in. Their footprints would be covered, their tracks lost among ordinary night marks, their presence reduced to a puzzle the garrison could not solve quickly enough to punish. And behind them, the ridge remained standing, still there, still armed, still shouting orders, but captured in everything that mattered, except noise. By morning, the outpost's loss could be measured in practical terms. A listening node had been neutralized. The supply route beneath the ridge loosened, if only for a time. Convoys could move with less fear of being reported, patrols could shift, a local front line could breathe again. In war, breathing room is not comfort. It is logistics regained, minutes saved, and pressure redistributed along a map that never stops tightening. But the deeper effect spread in the mind. Defenders who had trusted their ears found their confidence weakened. Sleep fractured. Routine became suspect. Men who had grown comfortable with the sounds of night, wind, animals, distant guns, now heard those same sounds with a new suspicion. A perimeter is not only wire and sandbags. It is a belief system. And that belief system had been violated without the dignity of a fight. A micro-beat captures that shift better than any report. A guard on the next night's watch flinches at an ordinary sound, a twig snap, a faint metallic tap, a cough muffled in a sleeve. He flinches because ordinary has become a possible weapon. The mind begins to run ahead of evidence, and once it does, fatigue grows faster. When every sound might matter, no sound can be ignored, and attention becomes a drain that empties men before the enemy even arrives. Higher command investigates, as commands always do. Officers visit the site, ask questions, gather statements, measure footprints in mud and snow. But they find no obvious firefight. No scattered shell casings in volume. No clear warning sequence, no flare that should have risen, no shouted alarm that should have organized response. Instead, there are missing men and missing certainty. The outpost exists, physically, but its story is incomplete. And an incomplete story is one of the most corrosive things an army can carry because it cannot be turned into a simple lesson. This is the paradox the audience should hold. Quiet victories can be strategically loud. They force expensive defensive changes. More sentries posted. More patrols walked. More flares issued. More dogs requested. More wire strung. More sleep lost. The cost spreads outward from one small raid into an entire sector's habits, consuming manpower and attention that could have been used elsewhere. Silence does not merely win a moment. It changes the price of staying safe. For the raiders, the consequence is different and more private. Silence has a moral price. Loud battle can blur memory into chaos, but quiet work is remembered too clearly. Faces, distances, timing, details preserved because nothing drowned them out. They return with success, and with a kind of clarity that does not always feel like triumph. And the consequence endures in the simplest lesson the battlefield can teach: not all power arrives with a roar. Some power arrives without warning, without spectacle, and with effects that echo long after the night becomes loud again. What began as an ungainly attachment, half laughed at in armories, did not remain a novelty for long. War has a way of filing down pride and sharpening what works. Engineers took early suppressor concepts and turned them into something closer to doctrine, not only designs, but rules of use. Durability became a requirement, not a hope. Maintenance became part of the system, not an afterthought. Realistic expectations replaced improvisation. A suppressor would not make a rifle vanish, but it could reshape the first seconds of contact if it remained consistent and if the men using it understood what it truly offered. Units learned the same lesson in practical terms. Suppressed weapons were not universal tools. They were specialized answers to specialized questions. They belonged to raids, reconnaissance, and work at the edge of the map, where the first sound could summon overwhelming response. In open battle, where artillery and machine guns dominated, suppressors mattered less. The tool had value precisely because it was not for everyone. Its purpose was not to win by volume. Its purpose was to win by timing. A microbeat often arrives later, after the war, in the voice of a veteran trying to describe what he carried. He does not say it was silent. He says it was muted. A flatter sound. A shorter reach. A report that did not immediately turn every head on the ridge. He remembers it not as a miracle, but as a purchase, seconds bought at a price. And he understands, even decades afterward, that those seconds were not abstract. They were a life's worth of distance, the difference between leaving the wire quietly and leaving it under fire. From that point, the larger arc becomes visible. Modern war increasingly rewards detection, signature management, and controlled engagement. The battlefield does not only punish the exposed, it punishes the predictable. As sensors improve, as communications tighten, as response becomes faster, the advantage shifts toward those who can manage what they reveal: sound, flash, movement, even the pattern of their presence. Suppressed warfare fits into that trajectory not as romance, but as a practical answer to a modern problem: how to act decisively without announcing yourself before the action is complete. In that light, the toilet roll joke becomes a historical clue. It reveals how often serious innovation begins as embarrassment. The earliest versions rarely look right. They violate the aesthetic that people associate with professionalism. They appear improvised because, at first, they are. Ridicule is often the first reaction to a tool that changes the rules, because changing the rules makes the old confidence feel fragile. The enemy adapts, as enemies always do. Better perimeter discipline. Lead alarms. Less reliance on hearing alone. More frequent checks, more sentries, more redundancy in communications. The outpost that once trusted routine now learns to distrust it. Silence forces defense to become more expensive because it removes the cheap certainty that noise provides. Once an army realizes an attack may begin quietly, it must behave as if every night is the night. This is the legacy in its simplest form, a quiet shift in what superiority means. Sometimes superiority is not being louder. Sometimes it is being heard last. Not because silence is noble, but because the side that controls the first moment of comprehension controls the shape of the fight that follows. And somewhere behind that lesson remains the original irony: an awkward tube once mocked in daylight, now understood in darkness as the difference between a raid that becomes a firefight and a raid that ends before the enemy can even agree on what happened. In the end, it is worth returning to the mockery, because mockery is often how armies defend their own identity. Men laugh at what looks ungainly because it threatens their idea of professionalism. Standard weapons carry authority partly through appearance, clean lines, familiar silhouettes, the comfort of what has always worked. An awkward tube on the muzzle feels like an insult to that order, an admission that improvisation has entered the uniform. Calling it a toilet roll is a way to push it back into the category of jokes, where it cannot challenge doctrine. But the Outpost raid, seen clearly, is not a story about hardware at all. It is a triumph of method, timing, discipline, and restraint more than any single invention. The suppressor did not win the ridge by itself. It bought a narrow window, and men trained to value that window filled it with correct decisions. Quiet steps. Correct rolls. Controlled shots. A plan executed without the emotional release of noise. In war, results often belong to the side that can keep its mind steady when the moment demands speed. Silence should also be judged honestly. It can reduce open firefights, and that reduction can save lives on both sides by preventing escalation. But it concentrates responsibility into intimate acts. Without the cover of chaos, each action is remembered with precision. A man does not forget the distance when the shot was taken or the second when a hand covered a mouth to prevent an alarm. Quiet warfare can be efficient, but it is rarely easy on the conscience because nothing about it feels accidental. The paradox is familiar across history. Wars celebrate big machines, tanks, bombers, artillery, the visible symbols of industrial strength. Yet small devices can decide critical local outcomes. A minor tool, used at the right moment by trained men, can open a route, capture documents, shift a sector, and force an enemy to spend weeks repairing confidence. Grand strategy often turns on humble details, and humble details rarely look impressive in daylight. The final image returns to the ridge at dawn. The outpost sits physically intact, but altered in the way that matters most. Men shout orders that arrive too late to change anything. Patrols run, radios crackle, search parties comb the slopes, and questions multiply faster than answers. The position is awake now, fully awake, but waking late is its own kind of defeat. The suppressed weapon remains unromantic. Still ugly. Still easy to joke about until the results make ridicule impossible. Because in war, laughter has a limit, and that limit is proof. They mocked his toilet roll silencer until he took the outpost without a sound, and the laughter died in the dark.